Michael lived in the silence between circuits. For 3 years, the Ethelgard prototype wasn't just a project, it was a pulse. He worked in the dim blue light of the sub-basement lab, far from the mahogany row politics. The CEO, Arthur Vance, called it the future of the firm. But to Michael, it was just math that finally behaved. Every decision Michael made was a trade-off: sleep for stability, a social life for systemic integrity. He knew the incentives. Success meant a senior partnership. Failure meant a quiet exit. He had calculated the risks, or so he thought, while soldering the final connections of the core logic. The cost of perfection was high, but Michael was a man who believed in the inevitability of the machine. If the code was right, the outcome was guaranteed. It was a beautiful, stable system. At 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the prototype breathed. The Ethelgard was complete. It was a masterclass in efficiency, a tool that could automate the firm's entire logistics wing with 99% accuracy. He watched the sun climb over the skyline, feeling the weight of a job well done. He had delivered the advantage Arthur Vance had begged for. Now, it was time for the promised reward. He checked his reflection, straightened his collar, and prepared the final report. He had no reason to suspect the system was about to purge its most vital component. He trusted the contract. But as Michael reached for the door to the CEO's office, he noticed the lock had already been switched to a digital interface he didn't recognize. Something about the air in the hallway had changed. Arthur didn't stand. He didn't offer a handshake. He just looked at the prototype sitting in its pelican case on the table. Julian was busy on his phone, barely acknowledging Michael's presence. "It works," Arthur said. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of utility. Michael felt the first tremor of isolation. The pressure in the room wasn't about the technology anymore, it was about power. "Julian will be heading the implementation team," Arthur continued, his voice flat. "He needs to learn the ropes of a major rollout. Your technical expertise has been adequate for this phase." Michael's silence was his only defense. He realized the senior partnership wasn't coming. The incentive had been a lie, a carrot dangled to ensure he'd finish the core logic before the purge. The betrayal was explicit now. Arthur leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're fired, Michael. Effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk for your personal items. Leave the prototype." Michael didn't argue. He didn't plead. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble. He knew the cost of a scene, and he wasn't willing to pay it yet. The escort was a public statement of his new status. An outsider. The co-workers he'd mentored for years suddenly found their keyboards very interesting. The distortion of his reputation had already begun. As the glass doors slid shut behind him, Michael felt the weight of the city air. But in his pocket, his hand brushed against a small, encrypted USB drive he hadn't mentioned in the final report. 2 weeks of silence followed. In the distortion of the corporate press releases, Julian was hailed as the architect of Ethelgard. Michael was never mentioned. He had been erased from his own creation. Michael watched the PR spin from his kitchen table. He saw the hidden damage in Julian's televised interview, the way the boy couldn't explain the redundancy layers. The technology was a ticking clock in his hands. The knock came at 9:00 p.m. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor. It was the desperate thud of a man who had run out of options. Michael stayed in the shadows, waiting. Julian looked nothing like the architect from the news. He looked like a child who had broken an expensive toy and realized he didn't know how to fix it. The power shift had begun. Michael opened the door just enough to see the desperation in the boy's eyes. Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He started talking before the door was fully open, his voice cracking under the pressure. "It's the core logic, Michael. It's locking us out. The board is meeting tomorrow morning. If the system doesn't live stream the logistics update, my father, he'll lose the contract. I'll lose everything." Michael listened. He remembered the sneer in the boardroom. He remembered the security guard's hand on his shoulder. He weighed the cost of his help against the value of his own pride. Julian stopped talking, his chest heaving, as he waited for Michael to say the one word that would save him. Michael took a slow breath, leaned in, and whispered something that made the color drain from Julian's face. "No," Michael said. The word was a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. Julian's mouth hung open, his breathing shallow. He didn't understand. In his world, every man had a price. "You don't understand," Julian hissed, stepping closer. "If this fails, he'll destroy me. He'll make sure I never work in this city again." Michael didn't flinch. He watched the boy unravel. The isolation was absolute now. Michael was the only person with the keys to the Ethel Guard, and he was staying outside the gate. Then the distortion broke. Julian's face twisted into something primal. His fists swung in a desperate arc, connecting with Michael's jaw. The sound of bone on bone echoed in the narrow entryway. Michael fell back, the world tilting. Julian stood over him, panting. As Michael tasted iron in his mouth, he looked up at the boy and realized that Julian hadn't just committed a battery. He'd handed Michael the legal crowbar he needed to pry the company apart. Michael didn't call the police. He called Marcus Thorne, a man whose legal fees were higher than Michael's former salary. They met in an office that smelled of old paper and expensive scotch. "He punched you?" Thorne asked. Michael nodded, touching his face. The distortion of the corporate world usually favored the man with the most lawyers, but this was different. Thorne looked at the footage and smiled. "We're not going after him for the assault, Michael. That's too small. We're going after the Ethel Guard patents." Thorne explained the strategy, proving the termination was a breach of intellectual property rights. Thorne leaned forward and said, "I just sent the first injunction to the board of directors, not to Arthur, but to the people who actually own his chair." The manipulation had begun. The board meeting was a study in controlled panic. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of iron, but his hands were trembling beneath the mahogany surface. The distortion of the official narrative, that the rollout was on track, was crumbling. The injunction had frozen the server nodes. The Ethel Guard was offline. Every hour of downtime cost millions. The hidden damage was becoming visible. The company's largest contract was dependent on the update. The director leaned in. "Arthur, fix this, or we will find someone who can." The power was shifting. As Arthur walked out of the boardroom, his assistant handed him a phone with a blocked number, the same number Michael had used to call the board 10 minutes earlier. The reversal was starting. Michael watched the news from a park bench. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting for the system to eat its own. The betrayal he'd suffered was now a virus in the Vance infrastructure. He'd sent the board the data from his USB drive, the redundancy layers that Julian had accidentally deleted. He'd proven that the architect was an imposter. Arthur's allies were disappearing. The board had already begun quiet negotiations for a hostile takeover. Michael's phone buzzed. It was a message from Arthur's personal line. The power shift was nearly complete. Michael knew the cost. He typed back a single address, not the Vance office, but the sub-basement lab where the prototype had first breathed. It was time for the quiet moments to end and the intent to be revealed. The lab was cold, the blue lights flickering like a dying pulse. Arthur Vance stood among the empty server racks, his silhouette looking frail for the first time. The distortion was gone. "You think destroying this company will make you whole," Arthur said. Michael stepped into the light. Arthur offered a check, the false resolution. "Take this and walk away, for real this time." Michael looked at the paper, then at the man. The hidden damage Arthur had done to his own son was the real tragedy, but Michael wasn't there for pity. He tore the check in half and dropped it. Michael said, "I don't want your money, Arthur. I want the one thing you can't buy back." He looked at the prototype, its white light reflecting in his unblinking eyes. The revenge setup was done. The revenge setup was a masterpiece of legal architecture. While Arthur was pleading in the lab, Marcus Thorne was filing the final papers for the shareholder rebellion. The betrayal was now systemic. Michael had negotiated a deal, a hostile takeover by a rival firm with him as the new CEO. The board's incentive was survival. They would sacrifice Arthur and Julian to save their portfolios. The distortion was now working for Michael. He watched as the security teams began clearing Arthur's office. Every action Michael had taken since the punch had been a calculated move toward this moment. Michael sat in his car, watching the lights go out on the top floor of the Vance building, and realized he hadn't felt a single shred of guilt. The payoff was approaching, landing with irreversible weight. The next morning, the reversal landed like a hammer. The news headlines shifted to Vance scandal. Julian was arrested for assault, the video from Michael's entryway playing on a loop on every major network. Arthur Vance was forced into early retirement with no severance. The board issued a public apology to Michael, reframing him as the visionary founder who had been wronged. The manipulation was complete. Michael walked back through those glass doors, not as an engineer, but as the owner. The co-workers who had looked away now stood and applauded. The cost of their respect was their shame. Michael accepted it all. He walked past Julian's empty desk and saw a single framed photo of father and son, now a relic of a collapsed dynasty. He reached out, his hand hovering over the glass, but he didn't touch it. Michael stood in the boardroom, the same room where he'd been fired. The atmosphere was different. The air was thick with the scent of fear and ambition. The revenge execution was almost finished, but the aftershock was beginning to spread. He looked at reports of layoffs in the manufacturing division, collateral damage from the takeover. The system didn't care about justice. It only cared about efficiency. Michael had won, but at the cost of the very integrity he'd once prized. The distortion was now his own. He spoke to the remaining board members about synergy, words that felt like ash in his mouth. He was now the man at the head of the table, making the same trade-offs Arthur had made. He opened the drawer of the CEO's desk and found a handwritten note from Arthur, dated the day Michael was fired. The note was short. "You'll learn. The prototype is easy. The people are the problem." The brutal payoff wasn't the money or the title. It was the realization that Michael had become the very thing he hated. The unresolved truth was that the system hadn't changed. It had just swapped one driver for another. Arthur was gone, Julian was in a cell, and Michael was the king of a scorched earth. The prototype didn't care. The corporation would thrive under Michael's cold, engineered logic. He picked up his phone to call the next phase of the rollout, his voice now sounding exactly like Arthur's. The revenge was inevitable. He looked at his reflection in the glass, straightened his collar, and for the first time, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The cost was paid and the fallout was complete.